Hey, welcome. Thanks for checking out my channel. Today we are going to focus on the effort of exploring and ultimately mastering the mood, a color study of Ivan Shishkin's Before the Storm oil painting. We're going to do a little demo on my small 5-inch by 7-inch wood panel covered with gesso. As you can see, I'm mixing up some white, adding some additional linseed oil to my titanium white, which is an integral part of my palette. I'm also going to be working with ultramarine blue, starting at the top there, plant green, sap green, India yellow, Naples yellow, transparent red oxide, and burnt umber. So I do appreciate you joining, and welcome back to those who have watched some of my videos in the past. We're going to dive into the world of Ivan Shishkin, one of the greatest landscape painters of all time, and definitely of the 19th century. We're going to be working to create a small color study inspired by his masterpiece Before the Storm, which you can see a picture of in the upper right-hand corner right now. This painting captures the dramatic mood of an impending storm with its dynamic skies, lush and detailed forests, and depth that you'll see within his painting. And even though it has a little bit of a darker theme with some rich dark shadows, including warm and cool hues, it has also a certain amount of brightness to it where the sun is filtering down and hitting those lush green fields. So in this video, I'll walk through kind of step by step the process by which I will create this color study. So let's get started. Well, wait a second. Before I do, in the background here, I'm just assembling some additional materials beyond the brush that you saw. I'm also grabbing my palette knife, cleaning it off with some paper towel. What I want to share with you is some lesser known facts that I've researched about Ivan Shishkin. He apparently was nicknamed the Forest Czar. Shishkin's exceptional ability to capture intricate details of trees and forests earned him this affectionate nickname. His peers and critics often referred to him as the Czar of the forest painting. He was a meticulous draftsman, apparently. It's said that he would spend weeks or even months sketching outdoors prior to starting a larger painting, and his detailed pencil and ink drawings were often considered masterpieces in their own right. He contributed to Russian landscape etching as well, so he's not just a painter, but he also had some other creative outlets. And I noticed that to be a fairly common theme amongst painters from lots of different regions during this time period. Many were experimenting or dedicating significant time to the art of etching, creating wood carvings and printmaking and those sorts of things, which I think probably contributed to their masterful ability to simplify complex scenes. He apparently collaborated with, and I'm going to get this pronunciation wrong, the Abram Savo artist colony. Apparently, he was part of the artistic circle at Abram Savo, which was a community that played a significant role in the development of Russian national art in the 19th century. And he was deeply inspired by the Volga region, which I understand is not only just from witnessing his works, mainly electronic copies of his works. It was a beautiful region that he tended to spend a lot of time and energy on capturing the beauty of. He had a scientific approach to art, at least that's the way it's described amongst some of the descriptions that I was able to find. He was fascinated with botany and geology, much like some of the other painters that I follow, historical painters like George Inness and the Hudson River School painters. Many of those painters also had a fascination with those sciences. Interestingly enough, at the time, geology for many of them was an emerging science. It's kind of hard to believe, but that was the case. He was a professor at the Imperial Academy of Arts, and he taught at the prestigious academy in St. So right now I have a little bit of a flat brush. I believe it's number 4 if I'm not mistaken. That's not as important as what I'm doing. I'm dipping into my transparent red oxide, and I'm going to bring some burn umber into the mix here along with some oil. The paint's a little stiff. It's been stored away in a very cold or cool storage area, so it's stiffened up a little bit, and I'm using linseed oil to loosen it up. It's important to note that I don't have any technical notes with regards to how Shishkin approached to color mixing, or even handling the initial stages of constructing his paintings. What I intend to do here is a small color study. Hopefully that will take somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes. And in addition to that, I'm taking a much less scientific approach. My goal is just simply to explore ways with which I can create similar effects using my limited knowledge of oil painting. And what I'm going to do is start with a basic drawing in oil paint with this mixture of transparent red oxide and burnt umber. And I'm going to block in some of the basic shapes that are simple indications of where the dark shadow patterns exist. And from a general perspective, I'm going to start in the landscape itself, working from the background forward to the foreground, just creating some basic indication of those darker shapes. I'll probably add a little bit of color, and then I'll go ahead and start on the sky. So the process will start out a little slowly here, and it'll pick up some momentum as we begin to block in some of the bigger shapes. And if it wasn't apparent to you, I did measure out the rough halfway point, both on the vertical and horizontal axis, with those little marks that I put on the outer edge of my panel. And I do notice within the Shishkin original painting that the horizon line is a little bit off center, slightly above the halfway point. And I'm going to look to honor that with my little color study here. And I also noticed that the horizon is somewhat uneven. You'll see it actually go down slightly, moving from right to left, with that little mountain range and cliff barely visible off in the distance. So we'll just get some indication of that. We'll look to refine that as we move forward with the painting. And then we'll also work our way through by adjusting some of the hues as well. I'm looking to cool that off a little bit. Even in the early drawing stages here, I do want to put some cooler notes mixed in with these warmer notes consisting of burnt umber and transparent red oxide. So I've added a little bit of my ultramarine blue to the mix. It's a little bit off camera on my palette, but that's going to help give me kind of a warm, dark, and we'll incorporate that into the drawing as we make our way through this beginning process here. Now that I've laid in the distant horizon line, I'm going to add in some of the additional larger shadow patterns and shapes, moving into the midground and then eventually into the foreground. This is whether you're conducting a color study or studying the greats like I am today, or building your own original painting either in studio or on plein air through direct observation. This is arguably the most important part. It'll ultimately dictate the design of the painting and lay the foundation for what could be an attractive, pleasing outcome. So, what I've read in several painting books is that, a painter can tinker with color and stretch the bounds of reality with color and still have a successful outcome with their painting. But the two things that most painters will find very difficult to stray from are some of the basic rules related to design, and then also honoring the values associated with a scene. And that's just simply an indication of the lights versus the darks, the light colors versus the darker colors in a scene. Essentially, I've heard it said one way, shape, or form by multiple teachers, multiple artists that I admire, that if you get the values right, if you get the design right, you pretty much are guaranteed a reasonably successful painting. So I'm trying to honor Shishkin's masterful design. You do see a little bit of an S composition here. It's a little bit of a compound S. There's also some other elements of classical landscape design that you might be able to draw from directly from the composition of outdoor painting, which is one of the seminal books on landscape painting design. And you see a couple of examples that you can draw from within that particular text within this composition. And I'm going to do my best to honor those, starting with the dark shadow patterns. We're just going to add in some of the basic shapes of the trees off in the distance, some in the midground, and also some in the background as well. And we're going to start with the darker shades that we see within those shapes. Eventually, later on in the painting, we'll add some midtones and highlights and create some additional variance to the texture within the trees, hoping to create the illusion of capturing details associated with the foliage and branches and trunks and that sort of thing. For now, we'll leave that out and just focus on the general shapes. Now, I did lose some footage, so unfortunately we're missing out on the process of adding the green that you see there, and I've moved on to the sky. But within those areas where we see open fields represented by different shades of green, I blocked in a mixture of sap green and plant green, and in some cases a little bit of ultramarine blue was added, or burnt umber in some cases as well, to darken the value of that particular green. But that's what I did. I just filled in those white areas that were left by the shapes that had been put in with that transparent red oxide and burnt umber mixture. And now I've mixed a bluish gray, which I see in my view as the darkest shadow pattern area within the sky that Shishkin painted within this wonderful painting. So I'm adding that in, knowing that I'm going to take the value much lighter in certain areas within the cloud masses, just massing in these shapes, covering the surface at this point in time. And I think when we shape some of those clouds and try to create some of those sky effects, you have kind of a monochrome dynamic where blue is the dominant color, this bluish gray. I'm excited to see how that turns out. You may notice that throughout this process, I'm kind of tinkering with my pool of bluish gray, adding more ultramarine blue at times, adding some additional titanium white at times as well. And I'm just trying to create some variance in texture amongst the clouds, even though they're off in the distance, and even though they're part of a large storm cloud mass. We do want to create some interest by varying the textures, by varying the values within that cloud mass as well. I'm going to use some of that same color to mass in an initial shape indicating water here in the more distant foreground. At the bottom of the pathway, at the foreground of the painting, there is not only a really dark shadow that includes a lot of cool hues, but there's also a body of water that is hinted at as well. And even though Shishkin's paintings look incredibly detailed, the rendering of detail is amazing, he does leave a lot up to suggestion, like a lot of the great artists do. I'm thinking of Peter Monstadt, for example. I kind of lump him into a similar category. When you look at his paintings, they look remarkably well rendered, so realistic, even hyper-realistic at times, but he still maintains that painterly quality, which is just wonderful. And you see that with Monstadt, as I mentioned. You see that also here with Ivan Shishkin as well. There's so many wonderful things about doing these studies. You learn about your own tastes. You learn about some of the visual vocabulary that these great painters used. Even though we don't have technical notes and we don't have some academic lecturing us about how to achieve these effects, you still do learn by trying to model the colors, the shapes, and solve some of the same problems, perhaps maybe in our own way as artists, that they had to solve when rendering these scenes. Also, by working small, we save time. If I were to create a color study that was much larger than this, it might take me a couple of days. This will take me probably a sum total of 45 minutes. And we also get to work with tools that we sometimes might not work with all that frequently, like this small little flat brush that I'm using. This is a small brush that it was gifted to me that I hardly ever use because I tend to work with much larger brushes, especially when painting on plein air. And I'm using that to both mix up and also lay in this light blue hue that's at the top of the sky, where you kind of see there is a layer of clouds in the upper atmosphere covering the whole atmosphere, and happens to be this cloud layer, this shell, is hovering above the storm cloud mass, and you see some light filtering through that upper layer of clouds is being lit up, and it creates this kind of royal blue or baby blue hue. So we're capturing that. And I'm also adding in some variance within the large storm cloud mass, and also creating some lightness closer to the horizon to help further differentiate between the cloud mass and the horizon line, and also hopefully create some additional depth. You'll see this quite a bit when you have a large cloud mass like this. It might be quite dark in the area of the cloud mass and below wherever the light is blocked, and oftentimes creating its own shadow through the thickness and opacity of the cloud itself. And then off in the distance, where there might be a little bit of a break between the cloud and the surface of the earth, you'll see some additional light filtering through, and I'm trying to create that indication of that there with that lighter grayish area toward the horizon. And from here on out, I'm just playing with some shapes, not looking to finalize anything, but just Just want to create some interesting shapes, both on the edges of the cloud masses, but also within the cloud masses themselves. And I am tending to let vertical strokes dominate these areas because I do find that in my observation of other artists, other paintings that I've seen and that I've appreciated, vertical strokes tend to do a better job in translating through this visual language of painting areas that involve open space. And when painting clouds, when painting open skies, when painting sunlight and those sorts of things, for whatever reason, it tends to create a more pleasing effect when trying to render those sorts of areas within a painting. So you will see some horizontal and diagonal strokes, but because there is a little bit of chaos associated with the storm clouds. But for the most part, those vertical strokes, up and down strokes, will dominate this area. And I'm just reinforcing some of the darkness, some of the darker, cooler shadow areas within that storm cloud. I'll smooth some areas out. And we're just tinkering here at this point. And at some point, I'll get it where I'll feel good about where we are. I'll feel like it's close enough, not perfect in any sense, but close enough to the Shishkin original. And then I'll move on to the next section. Some additional interesting facts about this wonderful artist, Ivan Shishkin. Apparently he faced some personal tragedies. He experienced several losses, including the deaths of his wife and 2 children. From what I've read, it profoundly affected him. And despite this, he channeled his emotions into his art, often finding solace in nature. And in addition to that, he painted until his final days. Shishkin passed away in 1898 while working in a studio. His dedication to his craft was unwavering, and he left behind an extraordinary legacy of Russian landscape art. He was at the top of his game right up until his final days, apparently. So I've read that he admired, Shishkin that is, Western European art as well. So while he was a champion of the Russian landscapes, he also admired and studied the works of Western European artists during his travels. He particularly picked up some stylistic ideas in Germany and Switzerland, where he refined his technical skills as well. And I wasn't able to find any corroborating evidence of this, but I did read somewhere that he designed stage sets. So in addition to his landscape work, Shishkin occasionally collaborated with theaters to create set designs and featured natural scenery, further showcasing his versatility as an artist. And, you see this in a lot of modern day masters as well. So a lot of painters that I admire and have read biographical information on, autobiographical information on, indicate that there are a lot of wonderful landscape painters that either started their careers in set design or they participated in it throughout their career. I think that's kind of interesting. And I think I personally find it helpful to look for these trends because it does give some insight into how we might be able to improve as artists. When you look at success, you find clues, right? And I'm not saying that set design is in my future, but it's something that, I find interesting. Perhaps maybe mural painting is another example of ways with which you can expand your horizons as a landscape painter. Either way, stretching like this, I think, is really important. Trying new things. Ultimately, it could really help us take some great leaps as painters if that's our aim. In the meantime, while I've been dropping some knowledge bombs about Ivan Shishkin, I've been tinkering with my green mixtures. You can see on my palette, I kind of have a range of greens drawing off of the pool of plant green and sap green. I've added, in some cases, India yellow, some ultramarine white, and in other cases, Naples yellow. India yellow is a little bit of a warmer yellow. Naples yellow is a little bit of a cooler yellow. And obviously, titanium white is a cool color as well. I consider it a color. Some people don't consider black or white colors, but I do. And I've just started to lay in some indication of the wild grasses in this particular field in the foreground. I'm not going to work that too long here. Just wanted to put in some of the basic shapes. And also in the midground and the distant plains that are visible here, I've added in some indication of those grasses that are lit up by some of the light that's filtering through in front of those storm clouds. Now I'm also using some of those same greens to add some indication of some highlights on the trees, the tree foliage. And we'll refine this. That's going to take a little bit of work. I'm just roughing it in. And I'll also get some indication of some of the greens maybe along the pathway, in the pathway as well, because you do find little sprigs of grass growing up through even the most manicured pathways and sidewalks at times. I am working back and forth from foreground to midground to background, to the trees, to the grass, back to the foreground, midground, background, and so on and so forth. As I get a different a new color or version of the greens that I'm using, I do want to create as much variance as I can, creating that illusion of detail, making it seem that I worked hard to create those details. And in addition to that, honoring the varied textures and colors that we see in nature. So continue to do that. And now I've grabbed my brush that has some of that dark, cool color on there, and I'm augmenting some of those dark, cool shadow areas. Perhaps maybe as we make our way through this painting, I'll also bring some warm, dark colors in there too. And I'll also use this to refine some of the shapes, including that shadowy area along the edging of the pathway that we see in the foreground. So now I'm working my way through and I'm darkening this pathway because I realized that if I waited too long, I'd end up in a position where I'd have a hard time getting the pathway looking worn, weather worn, because I had taken the value, overall value, the average value of that pathway, the shape making up that pathway, a little too high. It was a little too light, and I needed to darken it in order to create depth and a feeling of natural weather-worn feel within that pathway. And I'm doing some of the same kind of things with the trees and some of the darker shadow patterns within the grassy fields as well. Just want to make sure I don't create a scenario where those shapes are too light too early in this painting. It generally is much easier to work from dark to light in oil paints. There are exceptions to that, and it's almost the mirror opposite of working in watercolor, for example. So just taking some time here to reinforce some of the darker shadow patterns before I bring some of the highlights into the painting. What's interesting to note about the design of Shishkin's painting is that he divides the composition roughly into thirds. The dramatic sky dominates the top, while the trees and the ground create a balanced foreground and middle ground. In addition to the S-curve composition design that we mentioned earlier, there's also elements of the steelyard composition design. And that's where you see the large mass of trees to the right and a smaller mass of trees to the left, thus creating almost like a visual tunnel to draw your attention to those fields, those ground planes in the midground, and ultimately to the storm clouds in the off distant part of the painting. Well, we're almost there. For the finishing touches, I'll be adding some small highlights to the trees in the foreground to enhance the contrast. I'm also, from time to time, going to be adding some titanium white with just a little tint to it, and you'll see that as part of the highlights that I add as well to the painting throughout the remainder of the process. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll be adding some more Study of the Greats tutorials in addition to some of the other works that I've been posting lately. Let me know in the comments if there's another painting that you'd like me to explore of Shishkin's, or if there's another painter that you would like me to add to the Study the Greats series that I've been working on now for 3 years. Also, check out the playlist, the Study the Greats playlist, where you'll see paintings that I've reconstructed in smaller studies like this one. Amongst those that I've included in my Study the Greats series, you'll see Claude Monet's work, you'll see Vincent van Gogh's work, George Inness, and many other great painters. So I appreciate you checking out this video. It's a great way to support me as an artist, and I am very grateful for you tuning in. Here's a picture of the final color study. Thanks again for checking out my video. Check out more of my work on my website at thomasmichaelnieman.com. Thanks again. Stay well.